So we are actually going to get to the slides in just a moment that are new, but I want to go back and just pick up this part this evening. We're talking about Jesus. We're talking about evidence for Jesus. We talked about earlier in this class, in the earlier slides that you have on your papers, we talked about Jesus as a historical person. So there's not any question from a historical standpoint that Jesus really did live. A lot of questions from a historical standpoint as to who Jesus was, clearly. That's what we're discussing. But from the standpoint of did Jesus live, not any real historical doubt about that at all. So I started off, as we got closer to this section, with 4 historical facts. I want to repeat these, then we'll get into some new material. So the first historical fact is that a man named Jesus lived in Palestine during the 1st century A.D. Again, I think we laid that out pretty well from historical sources, as well as what we have in the New Testament. There's not any question about this, okay? Jesus was a real person who lived in the 1st century in Palestine. We also can say very firmly from a historical standpoint that he was executed in Judea when Pontius Pilate was Roman governor. All right, we have that information not only in the New Testament but outside the New Testament. I will just say this as well. That pinpoints to a very narrow time frame as to when that happened, because Pontius Pilate was only governor in Judea for a short while. Okay, he did not rule as a Roman governor forever and always. Generally, their rules were pretty short. People got moved around. New governors were brought in. And in fact, during the period, the New Testament period, there would have been several governors in Judea. But we can pinpoint into when Pontius Pilate was the governor. Our alarm system is giving us problems tonight. Our third historical fact is that Jesus was buried, and on the 3rd day his tomb was found empty. Notice, I did not say that on the 3rd day he was resurrected. That is not a historical fact, but that is something that we're going to talk about based on testimony this evening from the New Testament. But there is no question that on the 3rd day his tomb was found empty. Okay? So, an empty tomb is something that we need to deal with, and we need to try to find an explanation for. Our 4th historical fact is that about 50 days after his death, his disciples began to preach his resurrection. When did that happen? I say 50 days after his death. What is that? Pentecost. It's the day of Pentecost, which is recorded in Acts chapter 2. That's the first time that the fact, or that their belief, I should say it that way, their belief in his resurrection is proclaimed publicly. During the interval of that time, for a good part of the interval of that time, what's happening after the resurrection before Pentecost?
He's appearing to
Okay, Jesus is preparing his apostles. He's spending time with them. He's making some appearances. And so in the previous class, we talked about some of the people that Jesus appeared to. And of course, he appeared to the apostles. He appeared to some women. Who are some of the women he appeared to? Mary Magdalene. Who else? Anybody remember? There's another Mary. The other Mary. Okay, good. The other Mary. Good. All right. And who else? There's a significantly large group that he also appears to.
more than 500.
More than 500. Paul tells us about that. We don't know anything else about that, except that by the time Paul is writing about it, he says, some have died, most are still alive. So there would have been a sizable chunk of people out there in the 1st century that could say, we saw the risen Jesus. So those are our 4 historical facts. What we're going to have to deal with in this class tonight, possibly on Sunday if we don't finish, but I think we'll finish it tonight, is some explanations for the empty tomb. Because remember, that 3rd fact is what? The tomb was empty on the 3rd day. Not a fact that Jesus was resurrected, but the tomb was empty. And so we have to find some kind of explanation for that, because, when a body just disappears, especially when that body is of someone who is quite significant, all right, we need to find an explanation for that. Because bodies don't generally do what? Disappear. They don't just disappear. They don't walk off on their own. Unless, of course, they are resurrected. Okay, which is certainly one of the explanations for the empty tomb. That is the explanation that Christians believed, and that was proclaimed on the day of Pentecost. So, we're going to look at this from the standpoint of if the resurrection is rejected, then the empty tomb must be explained. If we believe in the resurrection, there's no explanation needed because Jesus was raised from the dead. There's your empty tomb. That's why it's empty. By the way, that's exactly what the apostles proclaimed on the day of Pentecost. Right? Jesus was raised from the dead. They didn't have to explain it beyond that because that's what they are proclaiming. That's what they saw. That's what they believed, and they're giving that testimony. But if we reject that, then we've got to find some explanation for where Jesus' body went, especially since, and sorry for the pun, especially since Jesus' body is the bone of contention, isn't it? Ha 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 ha. Dad joke. I'm here all week. All right? Because if the body is not there, and if he wasn't raised, then we've got to figure out what's going on here. But if his body is there, or someone knows where it is, then on the day of Pentecost, when the apostles stand up and say Jesus was raised, somebody could kind of raise their hand in the back row and say, actually, no. Because I know where it is. And we can go have a look. Okay? All right? But we're going to have to explain that empty tomb if we reject the resurrection. These kinds of explanations began soon after the resurrection. As a matter of fact, we're going to see one that was actually given in the New Testament by the opponents of Christianity. So very early on, people understood if we're not going to accept the resurrection, we've got to come up with some kind of explanation for the fact that the body is missing. Other explanations have been added since that time, and we get one in the pages of the New Testament itself. There are three dominant explanations. Okay? There may be variations on those. All right? That's like a chocolate cake is a chocolate cake, except when a chocolate cake is a German chocolate cake or some other red velvet cake, right? Those are all variations on the basic model. So you have a chocolate cake, but there can be variations. We have three dominant explanations for the empty tomb, but there may be some variations on each one of those. All right? We're not going to try in this class to look at every possible nuance of every one of those explanations, but we are going to look at the three dominant ones. All right, so explanation number one is Jesus didn't really die. Okay? Jesus didn't really die. It gets called by various names. One of those is the swoon theory. I love that. Because when I think of swooning, I think of a woman who Prince Charming walks into the room and she swoons, right? She kind of faints a little bit. And so one of the theories is called the swoon theory. That's really what it's called. And that is that Jesus certainly appeared to be dead, but in reality he was not. Okay? He appeared to be dead. He wasn't dead. So once he is buried and he's put in that tomb where the air would have been cool and refreshing, like the air was this morning, right? Outside when you walked outside. Wonderful to finally get some fall. In the cool air of the tomb, Jesus revived and escaped. So he wakes up in the tomb. He says, well, I'm not dead. Somehow I'm going to get out of this tomb, and then I'm going to go about living my life. And usually in this theory, those who give this theory, is that Jesus left Judea and lived the remainder of his life elsewhere, perhaps as far away as Kashmir in India. Okay? Now, I will tell you, if you're wondering about that, why Kashmir in India, it's because this particular theory has become very popular with some people in the New Age movement who like to pick and choose things from Eastern religions, and so they like to make Jesus a guru from India. And so he wakes up, he's not dead, he gets out of the tomb, and, well, he's not sticking around in Jerusalem because what? Who wants to go through that again, right? So I'm going to leave Judea, maybe made it as far as Kashmir. There was a book several years back, Jesus Lived in India. It was written by a German, translated to a lot of different languages. It was real big in the Czech Republic long ago. I think it has been translated into English as well. You might find it in an antique bookstore. I would not recommend wasting your money on it, okay? It's just a bunch of historical nonsense. But he claims, this particular author claims that Jesus went to India, actually got married, and had children, and was a guru, an Eastern kind of guru there in India. All right, so that's the theory, the swoon theory. Jesus appeared to be dead, but in reality he was not. Well, as we look at that, we need to ask ourselves, again, we're looking at historical evidence, so we ask what is reasonable? Okay? What is a reasonable explanation? What's reasonable as we look at that theory? This particular theory ignores the precursors of crucifixion, the scourging, the exhaustion, and the shock. probably they can get away with that because they haven't seen anybody crucified, right? When was the last time you saw someone crucified? You didn't, because nobody gets crucified these days except in certain Muslim countries where people want to inflict a great deal of torture on an individual, and so it sometimes does happen in some parts of the world, but it's not a daily occurrence. In the first century, I'm not going to say it was a daily occurrence, but it was a frequent occurrence because the Romans would execute anybody who was a slave, not a Roman citizen, a rebel, by crucifixion. And so there were places that were set up for crucifixion. It was certainly nothing out of the ordinary. It would have been like hanging in the Old West. Most people who lived in the Old West near some sort of a town would probably have seen a hanging at some point in time in their lives because those were great attractions. Because in a small western town, nobody has anything better to do with their time, and so when they catch a criminal and they're going to hang them, what does everybody go and do? They go and watch the hanging, because why not? Well, for people in the first century, this would have been absolutely ridiculous. Okay, it would have been absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, this is not an explanation that is ever given in Scripture. The people who actually lived in the first century never came up with this kind of an explanation because they knew what crucifixion was like. When we talk about scourging, we're not talking about whipping. We're talking about the cat o' nine tails, if you will. We're talking about pieces of metal and bone embedded in each one of those strips of leather. We're talking about skin that was ripped off, muscles that were laid bare, bones were visible. Okay, sometimes people died from the scourging in and of itself, but if they didn't, they had probably been through a great deal of an ordeal, and they would be exhausted. And then you would have the pain, on top of everything else that's already happened, you would have the pain of having nails driven through your arms and through your legs. Okay, and we're not talking about the nails you would get at Home Depot. We're talking about Roman iron nails that were very large, very thick, and very rough. Okay. There were people who died before they were ever nailed to the cross. There were people who lasted for 3 or 4 days on the cross. It was all just dependent upon how everything was done, and it was dependent upon, I suppose, the individual as well. I might just say this. We don't have very many depictions of crucifixion in popular culture today. One of those that we do have is, I don't remember the name of the movie. Jim Caviezel plays in it.
Passion of the Christ? Yeah.
The Passion of Christ. Okay. I'm going to recommend the movie, The Passion of Christ, with a huge caveat. Okay? The huge caveat is that Mel Gibson is a very strong Catholic. And there's lots of Catholic things that make their way into that movie. You may not even realize that's what you're seeing, but it is indeed what you're seeing. However, the depiction of the crucifixion, the depiction of the scourging, is all excellent. And if you watch that and you don't cringe and you don't cry, then I think you've been watching far too many horror movies on television and you are numbed to what's going on there. Interestingly enough, the actor Jim Caviezel, I'm not sure how he says his name, when he's filming this, he had a metal plate, basically a suit of armor, if you will, that was on his back because he was really being scourged. Okay? No special effects here. He was really getting hit with this, and so he had some kind of a plate on his back to protect his back. One of the guys that was flailing the whip missed the metal and opened in Jim's side a 12-inch gash. Okay? So it's very realistic in the depiction of what goes on in the crucifixion. When you see that, the very notion that someone would wake up in a tomb, having gone through all of that, somehow makes his way out of that tomb, which is sealed by a what? Okay, a big rock. All right, that's my next point. And then manages to get to Kashmir in India. You ask yourselves, is that reasonable? Or is it grasping at straws? Pretty grasping at straws. Good. All right. Ignores the facts of burial. No water. They don't put any water in the tomb with him. Why would they? He's dead. Okay. If he wakes up, he's nearly dead. And so how in the world is he going to have the strength to move that stone? Stacey?
And the stone actually
is in a trough on the exterior of the tomb.
Yes.
So that really makes it tough from a physics point of view to actually be able to maneuver the stone away.
You'd have to be pushing it from the inside, and you'd have to push it against the things on the outside that are holding it in place. That would require a great deal of strength. And when the women go to the tomb Sunday morning, their question is what?
Who's going to move the stone for us?
Who's going to move the stone for us? And it's not just one woman. So she recognizes that she can't. Dad, your phone is
Blinking.
blinking.
I can see it.
You see it in the rearview mirror, right?
I got great peripheral.
It's still blinking, Dad.
They want me to sell my house and move it forward.
I guess. So that kind of a theory ignores that. It also ignores professionalism of Roman soldiers. Okay, because their job is to do what?
Make sure he's dead.
Yeah, their job is to kill him.
Not mostly dead.
Not mostly dead. Okay, Princess Bride, right? Not mostly dead. He's got to be completely dead. And they knew the difference. These guys were professionals at their job, right? They were not rent-a-cops. They were not mall security cops. They were the real deal. And their job is to kill him. They're not going to mess up on that, okay? It ignores as well important details of eyewitness accounts of the crucifixion. So, for example, when his side is pierced with a spear, what comes out?
Blood and water.
Water and blood, which is an indication that death had occurred. Jesus was dead. Okay? And so we get all of these details. You put all that together, and again, you're grasping at straws. All right, so here is a photograph. We talked a little bit about the tomb. This is not the tomb of Jesus. Okay? This is, however, a first century tomb from the same area, and so it kind of indicates how these would have been built. So you've got the tomb there below. You've got rock that is here and an archway that's been built. And the rolling rock actually rides in a trough right in there, and it rolls downhill. Okay? All of this is to prevent people from easily robbing the grave, and also to prevent something else.
The smell to escape.
It prevents the smell from escaping. It also prevents something else.
Disease.
Disease. It also prevents something else. It would prevent stealing the body. It also prevents something else. The occasional jackal coming along and having a dinner. Okay? No one wants that, right? You don't want to go to the cemetery. No one would want to go to the cemetery to visit their loved one's grave, get there, and the grave's been dug up. Okay? No one wants that. Well, they didn't want that in the first century either, so they would do this in such a way that it would be very, very secure. All right? Now, beyond that, we also know from the New Testament that it is actually sealed and a Roman guard is placed there also. And so, again, you would think that if the Roman guard is there and this 90% dead individual manages to get that rock open, you would think that their first reaction would be, well, I guess we didn't do our job very well, so now we're going to finish it. Nothing like that happens. Okay? All right. This is a quotation from John chapter 19, verses 31 through 34. There's another detail we want to talk about. Since it was a day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken. There's a technical term for this, believe it or not. In Latin, the term is crucifragium. Okay? It is actually a word that means breaking the legs of a crucified individual. Okay? And that they might be taken away. Okay? So the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and they might be taken away. We don't want them up on the cross because we've got the Passover. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. So they already know he's dead. They don't break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. All right. The significance of this is breaking the legs brought death virtually instantly to the person on the cross, because in order to breathe on a cross, you have to be able to push up with your legs. Okay? People on a cross are not sitting there, standing there, hung there, statically. A person on a cross is in constant motion up and down. They're pushing themselves up so that they can breathe. That's really hard on your legs when you've got nails in them. So when you can't hold it anymore, you release. Now, all of these muscles are being pulled up by your arms that are also nailed to a cross. That hurts a lot too, plus breathing is kind of important. So you don't get to breathe until you push up again. Okay? We don't have any experience with that in our culture and society, thankfully. We don't. But they did. And so if you wanted someone to die very quickly, you broke their legs, they could no longer push up, which means they could not breathe. How long do you live without being able to breathe? Not very long, especially after you've been scourged and nailed to a cross. Okay? So we get all of this evidence that's telling us that Jesus is what? Jesus is dead. Okay? He's not fainting or swooning on the cross. He's not being placed in a tomb and nobody happening to notice that he's actually breathing. He is dead. God gives us an incredible amount of evidence, almost as if God knew that some people down the road would come up with this idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. So there'd be plenty of evidence to say that in fact he did. That's theory one. Still got some more to say about it. I thought we were done. We're not. All right. Again, these soldiers, their professionalism, we already talked about that. They knew the difference between a living and dead person. No crurifragium is applied to Jesus for reasons that are not given, out of spite, maybe just to make sure. Jesus' side is pierced with a spear. But whatever the Roman soldier reason for doing that is, we get another piece of evidence showing that Jesus is dead. Okay. All right. So we already talked about the resulting blood and water is a sure sign of death. Okay. So before we go to number 2.
Stephen, are there any other historical records outside the Bible with any kind of detail about this?
About crucifixion?
This crucifixion. About
His crucifixion? No, just that he was crucified.
Okay. Oh, he was. Yeah, that we read.
We read that, yeah. And by the way, in the first century, no explanation of crucifixion was necessary. These people had seen it. These people quite possibly had had relatives who had been killed that way. When Spartacus led his slave revolt, you guys heard about Spartacus, right? They made a movie about it. Actually made 2 movies about it. When he led his slave revolt and it was finally suppressed, they captured 6,000 men and women. The Romans wanted to make sure slaves would never do that again. They crucified 6,000 of them, lining the Appian Way going into the city of Rome. Men and women. Okay, were crucified in that way. And of course, Hollywood, everybody said, I knew Spartacus. Who's not, you may remember that scene from the movie. But that was a message to everybody. You do not rebel against your masters. When they besieged the city of Jerusalem, Josephus, in the revolt, the Jewish revolt of 68, starts in 66, goes to 74. City of Jerusalem falls in 70. Josephus tells us that there was no longer enough wood around the city of Jerusalem to build all the crosses that the Romans needed for all the people they were crucifying. So when you go to Jerusalem today, you will not see an olive tree dating to the first century because they were all cut down. All the olive trees, all the other trees in that area are all later because the Romans cut them all down to use for wood, to use for fire, to use for crosses. These people knew what crucifixion was. They didn't need to describe it. We don't know what it is because to us, the image of crucifixion is probably out of the Catholic Church where a guy is hanging on a cross, and that's our idea of crucifixion. Not a whole lot of blood, okay? And oh, by the way, they make the crucifix G-rated because in reality you were crucified with nothing on. Okay? So you were being humiliated while you were being tortured, and you were always going to die. No one ever survived crucifixion. Right? Unless the Roman authorities chose to take someone down, no one ever survived crucifixion. So these people were intimately familiar with what it was. So we don't get the depictions because it's understood. But we do get some details. Leslie?
I have a bit of a side question. Was it only men that were crucified that way, or did they do it to women as well?
Women as well.
Okay.
And children?
I don't know if there's any records of children being crucified that way. Children,
Well, you said the Spartacus thing, so I'm thinking there was children there and everyone.
sure, but the best thing to do with children is make them slaves
Yeah.
or reintroduce them to slavery. This is not a class about the cultural world of the Bible, so I'll leave it at that.
Oh,
Right? Slavery was a wicked, evil thing. Women who were enslaved were abused. Children who were enslaved were abused. Remember, in the Roman society, a boy that did not reach puberty, we understand, right? I don't need to say it. Okay? They were abused. So children might have been just resold into slavery. It really depended on what hit them. I don't know whether they chose to crucify the men or the children or not, but women were crucified. Not on a routine basis, because women weren't routinely rebelling against Roman authority. They weren't routinely leading revolts. Most of the people crucified would have been men, but they had no problem crucifying women in that way too. Okay. All right. Theory number 2. Jesus' disciples went to the wrong tomb. All right. So early Sunday morning, the first day of the week, the women go to prepare Jesus' body, and lo and behold, the GPS was not working. They did not drop a pin in the right place. They went to the wrong grave, found it open, and Jesus wasn't there. They went to the wrong tomb. This is, some of y'all are chuckling. This is a serious explanation that is given for the empty tomb. Well, we can ask ourselves the question, did they all make the same mistake? Because the women go back and say, what?
Empty.
It's empty. What did Peter and John do? They run to the tomb. So they would have had to run to the same wrong tomb. Okay? Did Joseph of Arimathea not know where his own tomb was? Right? It was his grave. It prepared for him. He prepares the body. Or the initial preparation. Didn't he know where it was? What about the Jewish leaders? Didn't they know? Can you imagine how embarrassing that would have been as Peter and the apostles are standing up on the day of Pentecost and they say, Jesus was raised from the dead. And so one of those Pharisees points at his lieutenant and says, hey, go to the grave and open it up, see what's in there. And he goes to the right tomb and finds Jesus' body is there. And they put it on a gurney and bring it back to where the apostles are. Can you imagine how embarrassing that would have been? Can you imagine what that would have done for Christianity right then and there? Finito. Done. Okay? It's all over. Because now no one's going to believe you because Jesus is, first of all, not raised. And second of all, y'all are a bunch of liars, or there are probably some other words we could use that would be nice. All right? Didn't they know where the right grave was? Well, of course they did. Okay? In fact, the Jewish opponents of Christianity never denied that Jesus' tomb was empty. They only tried to explain why without a resurrection. Can't have a resurrected Jesus, because if we have a resurrected Jesus, we're all going to have to do what? We're all going to have to become his disciples. And we're not interested in that, so we got to have an explanation. The tomb is empty. Why is it empty? How did it get to be empty? The Christians say resurrection. Some folks say Jesus woke up. Other folks say everybody went to the wrong tomb. But that gets us to the third explanation. Okay? Jesus' body was stolen. This is the first explanation that's put forward. This is the one the Jews put forward. All right? They can't deny the tomb is empty. They can't deny that the correct tomb is empty. So how are we going to explain that? Well, somebody stole the body. Okay? Now, specifically in the New Testament, who do they blame?
The disciples.
The disciples. They stole the body. As a matter of fact, they pay the Roman guard to make that claim. And they say to them, when the governor finds out, because he's not going to be very happy that you did not guard what you were supposed to guard, we'll make sure it's all taken care of. And so that's what they tried to claim. Right?
Stephen, wasn't there some kind of wrapping in the tomb left?
Well, he would have been wrapped. Jesus' body would have been wrapped.
Some of that wrapping left in the tomb?
There was when John and Peter got there. Yeah. But the tomb's still empty. There's no body.
Right, but I mean, there's some wrapping there showing the end in it.
Maybe, but you still want the body.
Oh, yeah.
Because wrappings, I mean, you can go to the local whatever store and buy wrappings. You want the body. When there's no body, you got to do something with that.
Right, but but still, there's something showed he had been there.
It was the right time.
Or somebody had been there.
Well, true.
So this is the first explanation that's put forward. If this is true, that a crime was committed, what's the crime?
Theft.
Theft, okay, grave robbery, okay? And we can examine the suspects. Okay, so, quote from the Bible, this is Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 to 15. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. When they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. So the explanation is, from the Jewish standpoint, the explanation is the disciples came and stole the body. Alright, so, we have a crime. We have a crime. We got to look for a suspect. Y'all should look at the papers. Don't look at the papers. I have to give you the answer. We have a suspect, we have a motive, and we have an opportunity. Okay? Could I have a motive for killing Tom? Could I?
Sure.
You're a UT fan, aren't you?
UT graduate. And social.
That's, I'm an A&M fan. That's sufficient reason, right?
That's right.
Right there. Okay? I could have a motive to kill Tom. Let's say Tom shows up dead tomorrow morning. And the police come knocking on my door because now they have video proof that I said that and they have you all as witnesses. What are they going to what are they going to ask me? Time of death was 11 p.m. Where were you at 11 p.m. last night? Well, if I was at 11 p.m. with a group of 10 people at Chili's eating dinner, are they going to arrest me? No. They might check out the 10 people I was with, make sure they're not covering for me, but they're not going to arrest me for that. Everybody has to have a motive and an opportunity. Now, let's say Linda is there in the house when Tom is murdered. The spouse is always the first suspect, okay? Does she have opportunity?
Oh, yeah.
And no alibi. If you need to cut these off to your bedroom tonight, that's fine. So they're going to look at motive, right? They're going to look at motive. And if Linda just took out a $3 million life insurance policy on Tom a week ago, that might be a pretty strong motive. But you got to have both. You got to have motive, you got to have opportunity, right? So, let's examine some groups. There are 3 groups that are involved in the crucifixion of Jesus. The first of which is the Roman guard. Okay? Could the Roman guard have had motive and opportunity? I'm going to pull the answers because you see them anyways. Okay? Let's talk about motive. Did they have a motive for stealing Jesus' body?
Because they would die if he went missing.
Yeah. They've been ordered to guard the body. Okay? So if the body goes missing, it's going to be bad for them. As a matter of fact, remember what the Jews say? If word gets back to the governor, we'll take care of it. Because they know, and the soldiers know what's involved in that. Okay? So they don't have a motive to steal Jesus' body. Who was Jesus to them?
Just another
Criminal.
Yeah. And I want to say it this way, and I want you all to understand, I don't mean this in any bad way. He's just another stinking Jew. Because that's how the Romans viewed these people, by and large. Judea was not a popular place to get stationed in the Roman army. These people were troublesome. They were irritating. They had really weird customs. And every once in a while we get to crucify one. They didn't care anything about Jesus. If anything, they probably hated Jesus just because he was a Jew and a criminal of sorts. Okay? So no motive to kill him. What about an opportunity?
Yeah.
To kill him, to steal the body. Yeah, they're the ones guarding it. So, I mean, if you could come up with a motive, they do have an opportunity. They could open the seal, get rid of the body, reseal the tomb, whatever. All right? But we have to ask ourselves, is it reasonable to believe the Roman guard would have done that? Everything we know about Roman soldiers screams they would not have done that. They had no reason to. And they wouldn't have gone against their orders to do that. I mean, this was an army that executed people for falling asleep on guard duty. So it was discipline was serious in the Roman army.
You messed up as a Roman soldier. You got it.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you sure could. If you messed up in a really bad way, yeah, you could be executed. Second group. How about the Jewish leaders? Did they have a motive for stealing Jesus' body?
No, they wanted him dead.
They wanted him dead and in the grave. Okay? They're the ones, in fact, that asked for the Roman guard, don't they? Because the disciples said he was going to be raised from the dead. We don't want that happening, so let's put a guard on the grave. They ask for the Roman guard. They don't have a motive. Could they have had opportunity? Well, they could have. They could have gone back to the governor and they could have said, hey, can we rescind that order? All right? So they could have had opportunity if they called off the guard. There's no record of them doing that, but they had no motive. Their motive was keep the body in the grave. Because if that body disappears,
Now they've got bigger problems.
they got bigger problems. This fraud is going to be bigger than it ever would have been before. Let's keep him in the grave. All right, how about the disciples? Could they have had a motive? I'm going to suggest to you, yes, with some question marks. You spend 3.5 years following this guy all over Judea and Galilee. You spend 3.5 years believing he is going to institute the Jewish kingdom again. You spent 3.5 years believing he is going to kick the Romans out of Judea. And now he's dead? We can't let it end like that, can we? So, if we steal the body, we'll tell everybody he was raised, and then the movement can continue. Is that terribly far-fetched? 3.5 years is a significant amount of time out of your life. And then to think that what you've been following and believing in this entire time is over? Let's see if we can keep it going. So there's possibly a motive there. But what about opportunity? Not so long as the Romans are there. In order to get rid of the Romans, we're going to have to do what? We're going to have to fight them. No record of that happening. No record among Jewish sources. If that had happened, the Jewish sources would have pointed that out immediately that was going on. Okay? In their sources, not the New Testament. It would have been recorded elsewhere. So, as we look at these groups, we don't find any reasonable group, I think, that would explain that. But we're not finished. So I'm going to share with you a quote from those letters of Trajan to Pliny the Younger. And he says, Pliny wants to know how to deal with these Christians that are in his province in Bithynia. And so he asks Trajan. Trajan's response is, they, the Christians, are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is, by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. What this tells us is Romans didn't kill Christians just for the sake of killing Christians. They killed Christians who would not recant. So when Christians were arrested, they're given the opportunity. Deny being a Christian, prove it. Worship our gods. It was easy to do. Burn a little incense to whatever god you want. And you get to go home. Now, these Christians in 112 AD, they're not eyewitnesses of the resurrection. So when they die for something they believe to be true. How many of you are willing to die for something you believe to be true? Raise your hand. Okay. If you're willing to die for something you believe to be true. All right. How many of you are willing to die for something you know is a lie? Raise your hand. How did the apostles die? With the exception of John. They all die as martyrs. We know it from the New Testament. We know it outside the New Testament. They all die as martyrs. They died for the cause of Christ. They died because they believed in Jesus. And they proclaimed and preached the resurrection. So when Peter is getting ready to be crucified, and historical records indicate that he was crucified, supposedly upside down. Okay. As they're getting ready to crucify him, Peter's there. If Peter knows that Jesus' body was stolen and he was in on it, and he knows that the way off of this cross that he's about to be nailed to is to simply deny Jesus, what would you expect him to do?
Come clean. In order to preserve his life.
Yeah, come clean to preserve your life. He doesn't. Neither do the others. And by the way, John doesn't die as a martyr, but he's exiled in very old age. Okay? Not an easy life. So this is what they're allowed. The question is not what is possible. Any of these things are possible. It's remotely possible that Jesus woke up in the grave, got out of the grave, went to Kashmir, got married, had kids, and became a guru. That's remotely possible. Very remotely possible, but it's possible. Right? The question is, what is reasonable? Looking at the witnesses, is it reasonable to believe their testimony? Looking at the naturalistic explanations, he didn't really die. Do they pass the test of reasonability? I'm not sure that's a word. But if it isn't, we'll make it one. All right? How we live and by what we live will largely depend upon how we answer this question. If you do not believe in the resurrection of Jesus, go home. Why are you here? These Christians of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, if they didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, why did they die for it? Why did they lose their jobs for it? Why did they lose their families for it? Remember, Jewish people that became Christians were kicked out of the synagogue. They were cut off from Jewish society. Why did they do that? How we answer that question is going to determine what we do with our lives. All right, so we're going to finish this evening with what's called the trilemma of Jesus. Jesus made some very concrete, morally vital claims. He made a claim to deity, but also a claim to offer eternal salvation based on faith in his claims. Jesus does not allow us to dismiss him as a, quote, good teacher or just a, quote, prophet. The quandary of dealing with his claims in relation to his identity is known as the trilemma. Not a dilemma, but a trilemma. All right? So Jesus makes some very vital claims. He says, if you will believe in me, I will save you. The comparison I give, Mark's a firefighter. Okay, we all know that. You're landing at DFW. There's an accident. Your plane's on fire. You can't get your seatbelt undone. And through all that thick smoke, here comes Mark. Mark's the one I would want coming through that thick smoke. Okay? And Mark says to me, I'll get you out. In that moment, I have a choice. Believe Mark or not believe Mark. What would it say about Mark if Mark got me about 3 rows down, turned around and sucker punched me, and said, no more 45-minute sermons. Okay? We're going to get a guy that preaches only 20. What would that say about Mark?
We don't thank him.
He would be a moral monster, wouldn't he? He would be a moral monster. If Jesus says, trust in me and I'll save you, and he can't do that, it makes Jesus not a good teacher, not a prophet. It makes him a moral monster. All right. So, now we're not done. That's our first bell. So, Jesus' morally vital claims. They are false. Jesus is aware of that. He knows they're false. That makes him a liar and a moral monster. Notice the L underlined. Is there a way to remember this?
Or a crazy person.
We're not there yet. He's unaware. He really thinks he can save you, but he really can't. He really thinks he's God, but he isn't. Okay? He's unaware. Well, one possibility is that he is a lunatic. And there's our second L. Right? Someone that makes, if you claim to be God and you're not, that's considered, a mental illness. So, he's unaware of the fact that his claims are false. He's a lunatic. Our second L. The other possibility is that it's true. He makes these claims and it's true. He really is God. In which case, he is Lord. And if he's Lord, here's our question, God exists. Those are our 3 L's. Is Jesus a liar, a lunatic, or a Lord? The Lord. Every single person has to make a decision on those 3. Jesus doesn't say, and doesn't allow us to make him some kind of good guy. There's nowhere in there for a good guy unless it's true. The Lord, the lunatic, or the liar. All right. Next topic. How do we get the Bible? That's Sunday morning.